Hey everyone, I hope you're doing very well at home. Today I'm going to go through a game between LCZero and an engine called Ethereal, played in the TCEC Season 17 Premier Division, played on the 2nd of April. In this game, Leela is playing with the white pieces and Ethereal is playing with the black pieces. Again, I'll post the game in the description below, which will give you all the information on what versions they're using in this competition. But I'll just go through the opening moves quickly. So it was d4, knight to f6, knight to f3 and e6, c4, b6 and then g3, with an interesting bishop to a6, hitting the c4 pawn, queen a4, protecting the pawn, bishop to e7, knight c3, and bishop b7, bishop g2. Both sides are given as castles, and then d6 by black. And this is the end of the book. So from here on in, it's both the engines making up the moves. And Leela first plays queen c2 here, so getting the queen back to a more centralised position, where maybe now white can even prepare to play e4, with the queen and the knight supporting it. And now black typically now plays the move c5, which is what Ethereal played. So basically black's got this nice sort of like triangle formation going on, and now this c5 pawn hits out at d4. I've played this opening actually myself as black, and it's actually, you get some good results with it, so I highly recommend playing this sort of opening where you've played d6 and b6 and shoved the bishop on b7. It's actually quite a nice position to have. Anyway, Leela continued with d5. There's no way white's going to take that pawn, it's just too good for black. And black took on d5, and then there was c takes d5. And there's quite a bit of tactics involved in this position now, because I was looking at knight takes d5, does black just win a pawn? Well, actually white's got the sneaky knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, and white can play now knight g5. So threatening mate with the queen on h7, and a discovered attack against the bishop on d5. Now this doesn't win outright for white, because black can play bishop takes g5, and white can play bishop takes d5. But the point is now, white actually wins the exchange. After black's best move, bishop takes c1, white can take the rook, and once the bishop drops back, white can drop their bishop back, and it's quite a clean and clear way just to win an exchange for white, and this is a nice position for white to be in. So instead of taking the pawn off, Ethereal played b5, trying to tempt the knight to take on b5, which is what happened in the game, so Leela takes, but now the pawn on d5 has lost its protection from the c3 knight, and now black can take this pawn because the knight on f6 protects h7, so there's no discovered attack with this knight again. So Leela plays knight c3, hitting the bishop, bishop goes backwards, and white plays rook to d1. So the only problem with black's position is they've got quite a weak d6 pawn, which is quite backwards, and this e7 bishop, it looks rather sad piece. It's protecting the d6 pawn, but it's not a very nice piece to have as black. So Ethereal got the queen off the d file and played queen b6, still protecting the pawn on d6 though. Bishop g5 was played, h6, bishop takes and bishop takes. And okay, the bishop's actually out now, it's no longer sad and protecting that d6 pawn, it's actually unleashed on this f6 file and has become a really strong piece with the queen and bishop eyeing up this b2 pawn. I did look at knight d5 quickly in this position, attacking the queen and the bishop at the same time. But black's best is to take this off, rook takes, and then play knight to a6, threatening knight b4. So once white drops the rook backwards, black can play rook to b8, where now this b2 pawn is actually under fire from 3 pieces. So rook a b1 makes sense, knight b4 attacking the queen and the pawn, and Stockfish gave queen f5 here, knight takes a2 and knight to d2, bishop takes b2 and knight to e4, attacking d6, queen a5 and rook takes d6. So black's actually a whole pawn up here. However, you would expect maybe white to hoover this c5 pawn up at some point. But interestingly, this position is given as equal, but it's certainly very, very interesting, and there's chances for both sides here. So knight d5 leads to an interesting position. Instead though, Leela played knight to e4, attacking the f6 bishop, and again black just took this off, and the queen recaptured. Now black shouldn't take on b2 here because then rook a b1 is just incredibly strong, pinning the bishop and white can play queen c2 next move and win the piece. Instead then, Ethereal played knight d7, knight d2 was played, and this is actually quite a nice move for white. So the queen and bishop are now threatening to hit the rook on a8, 2 rooks for the queen is threatened, and also white's threatening to play knight to c4, where this knight and the rook on d1 will attack this d6 pawn. So rook a d8 by Ethereal makes a lot of sense. It gets off the diagonal and also inadvertently protects this d6 pawn. Of course knight c4 is played anyway by Leela, protecting b2, attacking the queen, which jumps in to b4. Now I think knight takes d6 by white here would lead to a drawn position after queen takes b2. Rook a b1, queen takes a2, and then queen to f5, which is actually given as an equal position because the c5 pawn and this a7 pawn are so weak. I mean, black's a pawn up, but you expect white to win this back with ease. So Leela didn't play knight takes d6, she just played queen c2, bringing the queen back, protecting the b2 pawn, and now knight b6 was played. Again, if Leela played knight takes d6, black can just take on b2. After a trade and rook to b1, bishop f6, knight to e4, another trade, bishop e7 protecting the c5 pawn, again another dead equal position with an opposite coloured bishop endgame. So instead of taking on d6, Leela took the knight, knight takes b6 was played, a takes b6, and now bishop to d5 from Leela, stopping the progression of this d5 pawn coming up the board, and white basically dominates the white squares and black dominates the dark squares. And again, if queen takes b2 here, then white can actually just trade queens, and after rook b1, white's going to win the pawn back on b6, and this is probably another dead drawn endgame. So instead of taking on b2, Ethereal played b5, so gaining some control over the light squares on c4 and a4. Rook a b1 was played to defend the pawn, c4 was played by Ethereal, and then e3 by Leela, and now rook c8. And basically now Leela just puts all her pawns on dark squares because she's got a white squared bishop, which is a logical thing to do. So she plays h4, Ethereal moves another rook, king g2 was played, rook to e8, and now a3 hitting the queen, which drops back to a5, and Leela plays h5. So does the AlphaZero move, where this just stops the h-pawn playing h5. The pawn's quite safe actually on h5 because his bishop can always retreat to protect it, and it just stops black from advancing this g-pawn. So basically moving this h-pawn has just tried to squash black's position. Queen a7 was played by Ethereal, bishop to f3 now, with the rook attacking on d6, so Ethereal protects, and now b3 can be played by Leela. So c takes b3 is impossible because then queen takes queen will be played. So this forces black to push their pawn to c3, and Leela plays b4, stopping black from playing b4 and reinforcing the c3 pawn. So Leela's got a significant advantage now. It's all to do with the pawn islands. If we have a look at these pawn islands, okay, Leela's got 3 of them, one here, a few here, and then another one here. But actually Ethereal's got 1, 2, 3, and then 4. So Ethereal's got 4 pawn islands, Leela's got 3. But the c3 pawn, b5 pawn, and d6 pawn are incredibly weak for black. And as we'll see later on in the game, Leela really takes advantage of this. Queen d7 was played next, rook to c1, rook to b6, and then rook to d5. So white's still absolutely dominating the light squares, and after a few more moves, rook e7, queen d3. We see now Leela's got complete control over the position. So the rook and the queen are attacking b5 and also eyeing up this d6 pawn, and Leela could potentially sack on c3 with the rook as well, with the queen and rook eyeing up the c3 pawn. Rook e8 was played next, rook c2, rook e7, king f1, queen h3, giving white a little tickle with a check, but Leela just sidesteps it, the queen goes back and the king goes back to g2. Now here I think is a crucial moment in the game. I think Ethereal should just play rook e8 and do what they have been doing, just sit back, maybe just put the rook back and forth on e7 and e8 and see what white does, because the rook and the queen now are just protecting d6. They've just got enough position and pieces to be able to protect every single one of these weak pawns for the time being. I mean, potentially Leela will probably try and push this e-pawn to exert more pressure on black's position, but still I think rook e8 would have been a good move. Instead, Ethereal now played rook to e6. Bishop g4 here would have been interesting, but it doesn't actually win the exchange because then queen b7 can be played, pinning this d5 pawn. So if white takes on e6, black can just recapture with the pawn, and then this rook will be won. But instead, after queen b7, white could have played maybe e4, and then the threat of bishop takes e6 is still on. So rook e8, and again this is better for white now. White has more potential maybe to expand with f4 and e5. However, saying that though, after rook e6, Leela's move wasn't too bad. She played a trick, rook c5, and of course the d6 pawn is pinned. So queen e8 was played, and the rook just went back to d5. But now Ethereal is in a bit of trouble. Bishop g4 is coming next for white, and there's nothing black can actually do to stop it. So for this reason, Ethereal has to move their rook backwards. So they're preemptive the strike on g4 with rook e7. But now, of course, this just leaves white to win a pawn on d6. Rook takes the pawn, rook takes, and queen takes. And this is the beginning of the end for Ethereal in this game. So Leela's just a whole pawn up. Of course, though, it is an opposite coloured bishop endgame, so there are drawing chances. But as we'll see, rook a7, rook a2 to protect the pawn, queen d8, trying to trade queens, but then comes queen c5 attacking the b5 pawn, rook c7, getting the rook behind this c pawn. This could have been quite deadly, but then queen f5 to stop any c2 advances here. Queen d7 was played, and now a trade of queens, and king f1, and Ethereal played g6. So this allows the trade of pawns. Bishop e2 was played to attack b5, and now rook d2 was played with a very interesting endgame. So this basically forces Leela to trade rooks, so rook takes d2, c takes d2, and now the bishop can't actually take on b5 because then black gets a queen on the d1 square. So bishop d1 was played, bishop b2, and then a4, takes, bishop c3 and b5. And now we're into the endgame. And of course this looks rather drawish, but you have to say white's really doing better. Mainly because white's a whole pawn up, but they've got this passed b pawn that can run. They've also got a passed e pawn. And the bishop does a great job of stopping Ethereal's pawn right in its tracks. And basically I think white's got a great position. You've just got to get the king up to an ideal position and just launch these pawns up the board, which is what Leela does. So bishop a5 was played, king e2, king f7, king d3. The king went to g7, bishop d1, h5, and now f4. So again, just a quick note that white's shoving all their pawns on dark squares for the time being. King h6, and now e4. And Leela's got some great passed pawns here, and it's going to be very hard for black to stop these. g5 was played, so black's trying to get their own passed pawn with trying to push his h pawn up the board. So king e3 was played, g takes f4, g takes f4. So now black does have a passed h pawn, but it's very isolated. It's going to be impossible pretty much to get this queened, just because this pawn does a great job of stopping the king coming in, and this bishop also stops the king coming in. So this is actually a non-threat for black here. h4 was played in the game, king f3, and after bishop b6, king g4. Ethereal tries to protect their pawn with bishop f2, but now Leela just is in control. She plays e5, the king moves to g7, and bishop b3, so stops black from moving the king into the f7 square, and the pawn on e6 stops it coming into the f6 square, forcing the king to the 8th rank. And now Leela just starts playing with the food. King f3, hitting the bishop, bishop g1, the king goes back to attack the pawn, bishop protects once again, and Leela just plays b6, and this forces black to take this pawn off, which allows the king to take on h4. And now bishop d4, king g4, and this is just a matter of technique now from white. So basically all white has to do is push these two pawns up. She plays king e3 to attack the pawn. Bishop g3 is a cheeky move though from Ethereal, so the king can't take on d2, otherwise bishop takes f4. So king e4, king f7, check, king g7, and bishop goes back to c2. So there's a bit of back and forth for the time being, until white gets their king in a great position with king to d6, bishop h4 was played, king d7, And basically Leela's now threatening to play f5 and moves like e6 or f6. But Ethereal does come up with a nice move actually, bishop to f6, which is quite cheeky again. The point is, if Leela plays e takes f6 here, king takes f6, then this is just a drawn position, because once black plays d1, bishop's going to have to take it and black will win the pawn on f4. For instance, if f5, black can get a queen, bishop takes queen and king takes f5 is a draw. So bishop f6 is a sneaky move that white has to watch out for. Luckily Leela is a ridiculously strong engine, so bishop a4 was played, and then king to g7, king to d6, bishop d8, king d7, the bishop went backwards again with this trick, bishop to b3 and king g6, a check was thrown in, and eventually once white stops moving the bishop back and forth, we get f5 in, and this is game over pretty much. f6 check, the king goes backwards, another check, king e8, and Leela just advances these pawns. Ethereal tries to get a queen, bishop takes d1, and here Ethereal resigned the game on move 99. So an incredibly long game, but you have to say Leela's position was probably better all the way through. And it's hard to say where Ethereal went wrong, but I think it was that rook e6 move which ultimately led to black's downfall. I mean, they always had a weak d6 pawn, but they had drawing chances with an opposite coloured bishop endgame. But that seems to be the difference between Leela and a lot of other engines. She just seems to have that extra edge in the late middle game and endgame, where her pieces just seem to be ideally placed to deal with a lot of issues. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Please drop a like, comment or subscribe if you did enjoy the video. And I hope this video helps pass the time whilst you're all in lockdown. Stay safe everyone, and hopefully I'll be back with another video tomorrow. Thank you for watching.